Well, we come now to another one of God's choice servants, the Reverend Moses Ordway. Of all of the pioneers of Presbyterianism in Wisconsin, Moses Ordway is the most colorful, and it's not even close. His strong personality, his granite theological convictions, and his unusual methods appear odd to some. In 1943, W. Clyde Wilson, the stated clerk of the PCUSA Synod of Wisconsin, who was a modernist, wrote the following in a preface to the manuscript of Ordway's journal. This manuscript is not a journal, but an autobiographical story written in old age by an eccentric person when either memory or disposition handled facts in a freakish manner. At the end of the preface, Wilson adds another barb. This manuscript should be quoted with caution, since it is the source of a whole family of erroneous claims and has beguiled such men as the Reverend T.S. Johnson, who wrote widely in the religious press, and Mr. Ward White of the Wisconsin Historical Society. But upon closer examination, Ordway is not the oddball he was made out to be. Indeed, his influence was profound and his insights far-reaching. John Chapin describes Ordway much differently in an article on cutting marsh in the Wisconsin History Collections. From the various glimpses we get of the man, Ordway was an interesting and forcible character, courageous, clear-headed, direct and shrewd, as well as devoted. He seems to have been a tower of strength in that day. His opinions and sayings are much prized. We find traces of him in the important discussions in the church and in many of the revivals in this region. Let's look at his early life. Moses Ordway was born on December 27, 1788 in Haverhill, Massachusetts. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Tristram and Margaret Ordway. His father was a Baptist, was illiterate, and opposed Moses' formal education. Tristram was also a skilled mechanic and carpenter who taught his son many skillful things. Moses' mother, Margaret, was a Scotch Presbyterian. Margaret was literate and studious and had a reputation for reading. She raised Moses with the Westminster Shorter Catechism, thus imprinting Calvinism on Moses from an early age. Reflecting back on his catechetical training, Ordway writes, "The Assembly's catechism I had to learn as a matter of course, and its doctrine. I believed them then and do now. But I did not love them, but hated them, as I supposed, but found afterwards that it was God that I hated, not Calvinism. And as soon as there was a spark of the love of God in my heart, then I loved them as I did God." Moses was a sensitive child, as he indicates in his journal. He writes, "As to religious impressions, I was subject to conviction from my earliest recollection, and prayed very frequently in secret. When 7 years old, I remember distinctly of going into the woods and praying and promising God that if I ever became a man, then I would be a minister and preach hell to them harder than the ministers did." By his early teen years, Ordway was a skilled mechanic who handled all sorts of work. His father began hiring him out, and he gained a well-earned reputation and varied experience that would later prove useful. He reports having worked in a blacksmith shop, a wagon shop, a cabinet shop, a carriage shop, a cotton factory, and a turning shop. Though he suffered from delicate health in early childhood, he became healthy and strong during his teen years. A turning point happened at the age of 19, when he fell and seriously injured his right shoulder. His dreams of a life as a manual laborer came to an end, and he began considering further education. His first field of study was the medical arts. Around this time, there was a significant spiritual revival in his area, and Moses was converted. Thomas S. Johnson relates the change in his life. A great revival of religion soon occurred in his village. Young Ordway was converted, had a vision of the world of indifference and sin, and resolved to become a preacher. Ordway clearly felt the call to pursue gospel ministry. Knowing that his own father would be opposed to his pursuit, Ordway kept his plans secret. He settled upon Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. The institution was founded by Congregationalists and had a Presbyterian representation among the faculty. When his father discovered Ordway's plans, he was upset. And Ordway writes, "He was in a great rage and ordered me to pick up my duds and leave his house immediately." Ordway left the next day with the positive assurances that I should never have 1 cent of his property. Arriving at college with meager means, Ordway was admitted with some reluctance. Having brought his tools with him to school, he began performing various services for his fellow students in order to make money. When they would lock themselves out of their rooms, it was Moses to the rescue. And soon the college itself recognized his ingenuity and began utilizing his skill set for their institutional advantage. When he finished his studies in 1819, he reports that, "I came out of college as strong as a lion and ruddy, and with $70 in my pocket." Having completed his undergraduate studies, he next turned his attention to the study of theology under 2 private tutors, the Reverend Moses Sawyer and the Reverend John Whitten. His initial efforts at preaching were unfruitful and disappointing. He reflects on his first days, saying, "I was ashamed of myself and began to wake up and look at my promises to God that if he would put me into the ministry, then I would take an apostolic course, never be installed, but be a revival minister without any regard to pay, but wherever it was possible to gather souls to Christ." These were my views at the outset. Next, we consider his ordination and his relocation. In 1822, Moses Ordway was licensed to preach and spent time in northern New Hampshire and Vermont. These were discouraging years, as Erwin Bradfield reports. According to his own report, accomplished nothing, no souls converted. After a disheartening season of service with the Congregationalists in New Hampshire and Vermont, Ordway turned his attention to the Presbyterian work in New York. And Bradfield reports that in the spring of 1824, he was ordained by the St. Lawrence Presbytery, New York. His preaching as a Presbyterian missionary was blessed by God, and he began seeing revivals and conversions. While he was in New York, Ordway was bitten by the Wisconsin bug. He reports, "On my way home from my revival meetings in the early part of 1836, I was violently taken with Wisconsin fever. Hearing about the opportunities for the missionary work in that wonderful new world that was opening up so grandly, I concluded that it would be wisdom to be in season and go there to do needed work in the new settlements. I commenced my preparation at once. I began to sell property in Rochester, and by the 1st of October, 1836, was ready to go. We went on an old steamboat that ran only by day, and in 14 days reached Green Bay, Wisconsin. I went immediately to the garrison at Fort Howard, and I called on Dr. Satterlee, the surgeon, a good and wise man, and made known to him my business." When Ordway arrived in Green Bay, he was less than impressed with the inhabitants of Titletown. He recorded his impressions of the situation. He said, "At this time, there were about 4,000 inhabitants of Green Bay, and they seemed to be agreed in only one thing, and that was to blaspheme God and indulge in all kinds of wickedness. Almost every other night, they would have a bonfire, and by the help of a whiskey band, have a dance which was so wicked and so wild that many of both sexes would lie drunken on the ground the next morning." Prior to this time, Cutting Marsh had occasionally come to Green Bay and carried on a ministry with interested folk. Marsh had laid the groundwork for Ordway to build upon by organizing the First Presbyterian Church in Green Bay on January 9, 1836. As already mentioned, Ordway was installed as the pastor of that church in late October 1836. Ordway remained in Green Bay for about 6 months. He describes his early ministry with the new church in Green Bay as follows: "My first discourse was on the subject of the carnal mind being at enmity against God. This was illustrated by the daily life of the people in Green Bay and went home to many hearts. This was on the last of November, 1836, and by the last of December, we had gathered a blessed harvest of souls, which brought up the membership to 80. These were received into the church in January and February 1837. This was a genuine work of grace and attended by many interesting circumstances." Well, much of Ordway's ministry was really aimed at planting new Presbyterian churches throughout the state. He describes his approach to church planting in his journal. "I have, in all my ministry, never sought for an easy place where they could pay a large salary, but on the contrary, have always looked for a miserable place where no harm could be done. I would look for the place where the people were so poor, stupid, or heartless that they would not ask a minister to preach to them, and would take pains to say that they would not be able to pay as a gentle hint to you to let them alone. In such a place I delighted to put my foot. But I never preached to them the love of Christ to harden them for a long siege, but began with St. Paul's doctrines, and very soon there would be a new face on things. As soon as they were awake, and God began to increase them, and they began to want to pay me, I would open the door for some anxious minister who was ready to work, and I would go to another place." Well, after establishing the Green Bay Church, Ordway looked south to Milwaukee. He had received requests from a group there, and with the help of Cutting Marsh, they assisted the folk in Milwaukee. Ordway describes the journey in February 1837. In the middle of February 1837, I took Brother Marsh, and we mounted our ponies and started for Milwaukee, where we had a call to form a church. And after sleeping 2 or 3 nights on the snow, we arrived safe in Milwaukee. Here we found a heterogeneous mass of about 150 men and 30 women who seemed to take an interest in our work. Ordway remained in Milwaukee for several months, preaching and teaching among the people. Apparently, Marsh returned home to his work among the Stockbridge tribe. He returned to Milwaukee in April 1837 by means of a steamboat. He departed from Green Bay, traveled to Manitowoc and Sheboygan, and finally arrived in Milwaukee, all for the fare of $3.87.50. As previously described, the group in Milwaukee were divided as to how they should organize. They took a vote, and 15 favored the Presbyterian form of government, while 11 preferred Congregationalism. Marsh participated in the organization of the First Presbyterian Church in Milwaukee on April 11, 1837. The Encyclopedia of Milwaukee describes the events as follows. After discussions and disagreements on the denomination of their new Milwaukee church, 18 congregational members, under the guidance of Green Bay area missionaries Cutting Marsh and Moses Ordway, met at the county courthouse on April 13, 1837, to organize the First Presbyterian Society in Milwaukee. Within a few months, the congregation had constructed its first building, likely the first church built in the city, at the corner of what is now 2nd and Wells Streets. Having outgrown its original site within a short time, First Presbyterian met in a rented hall in the early 1840s before moving to a new building on the corner of Mason and Milwaukee Avenues in 1842. It was around this time that Ordway filed a claim for some property in the Waukesha area, and he brought his family from the east to join him. He preached in the Waukesha area on an occasional basis before beginning a church at South Prairieville. He was there for 1 year before going to Pike Grove for nearly 2 years. He also had preaching stations in such communities as Troy. In 1842, Ordway moved north to the area of Beaver Dam. When he first arrived, it was untamed wilderness and only sparsely populated. Again, he describes his experiences in his journal. When we came here, it was a dense forest. No houses, no mills, no roads, and no fences. Only a few scattered people, and not a rich man among them. But in a few years, Grubville, as it was called, became a very noted place, with mills, churches, stores, and factories. But it cost much hard work, and it is true that I had no small hand in it. I owned the first sawmill. The people needed a grist mill, and I built one with 2 run of stones with circle saws and turning works. I hired capable men and superintended the work, and frequently put my own hands to the work. Mr. Brower and I surveyed and located all of the roads in and out of Beaver Dam as they now run to Watertown, Waupun, Columbus, Fox Lake, Lowell, Horicon, and Fall River. We helped build the pole bridges and other improvements without 1 cent of pay. We cleaned up the streets and plotted the lots and did what we could to promote the welfare of our city in the face of much criticism and many difficulties. Well, Ordway had preached to a group in Beaver Dam for 6 months before the Assembly Presbyterian Church was formed there in 1843. He remained for over 2 years, preaching to them and helping the church to grow. After he left Beaver Dam, Ordway carried on an itinerant ministry, and he catalogs the various locations in his journal. First, I went to Fountain Prairie, 14 miles through the woods, and not a marked trail. Then I formed a Presbyterian church and preached to them most of the time for 2 years. But about that time, Columbus was born and began to show signs of life, and this church was moved to Columbus and made a good nest for Brother Rosecrans. I next went to Lake Emily and formed a Presbyterian church and preached there for a few months. But about this time, Fox Lake began to show signs of life and was made the center of operations and the location at Lake Emily given up. Next, I went to Dodge Center and formed a Presbyterian church and preached to them a few months, but gave up this nest to Brother Phillips, who had just come in the country looking for a place to preach. Next, I went to the east side of the rolling prairie to form a Presbyterian church and preached to them for a few months until a starving minister by the name of Peck came looking for a good place to preach. This nest I gave up to him. About this time, Horicon was born. I then went to Oxford, 10 miles north of Portage City, and labored with them for a month or so. We had a small revival, and a Presbyterian church was formed of some 20 members. In all these places where churches were formed, Sabbath schools were organized and put in motion, and have not stopped yet. And besides places named, I preached frequently at other places in the region round about. Now, Ordway was very fond of pointing out that he rarely received any remuneration for his services. He did not ask for nor expect a salary as a pastor. It seems that his finances were largely supplied from his work as an entrepreneur, which included purchasing old houses, fixing them up, and selling them for a significant profit. He was flipping houses. Due to his mechanical skills and experience, he was able to successfully operate mills in Beaver Dam, where several other persons had failed to do so. Not only did Ordway not accept salary, but he delighted in contributing money to the salaries of his replacements. Several times he records that he paid the salary for the new minister for part or all of the man's first year at the church. I think Ordway practiced Jesus' statement that it is more blessed to give than to receive. But what about Ordway's Presbyterianism? Was he really a Presbyterian? Though Ordway is sometimes described as a New School Presbyterian, that designation is inaccurate. Bradfield describes him as follows: he did not withdraw to join the New School Presbyterian Church when it started, nor did he even unite with the Old School when it began in 1845 to 46. He remained in the convention to the end. He was, of course, acquainted with the plan of union in 1801, and perhaps accepted it or a similar plan as the best for Wisconsin under prevailing conditions. He definitely opposed Methodists and their Arminian theology, and had little sympathy with Baptists. He preached Orthodox Calvinism wherever he went, as may be observed from some of his sermon themes: God's eternal decrees, total depravity, election, the perseverance of the saints, the infinite strictness of God's holy law, the reasonableness of the doctrine of eternal hell. Ordway was anti-slavery, anti-liquor, and a stern church disciplinarian. He gloried in revivals and was devoted to missions. At times, Ordway would talk about using new measures, but he was deeply opposed to any new divinity or new theology. He deliberately sought to tie his new measures to old John Calvinism. He was an unapologetic revival preacher who proclaimed a message that was consistent with Westminster orthodoxy and strict Calvinism. One way his Presbyterian commitments are seen is his involvement in founding the Presbytery of Wisconsin and the Convention of 1840. The Convention of 1840 was, much like the Plan of Union, a cooperative arrangement between Congregationalists and Presbyterians to work in tandem in reaching the state with the gospel. The Presbytery of Wisconsin was organized as an independent presbytery, unaffiliated with any larger church body from the eastern states. Doesn't that just kind of say it all? An independent presbytery, unaffiliated with any larger church body from the eastern states. You might say, that doesn't sound very Presbyterian, and you would probably be correct. Bradfield writes, Ordway was also present and acted as moderator at the organization of the Wisconsin Presbytery, January 9, 1839. At the second meeting of the Presbytery, he reported the organization of the Presbyterian Church at South Prairieville. At the fourth meeting of the Presbytery, held in Geneva, June 6, 1840, Moses Ordway was again elected moderator. And when the Presbytery convened for the memorable meeting at Troy, October 7, 1840, at 2 p.m., when the Presbyterian and Congregational Convention was formed, Moses Ordway was the presiding moderator. Thus, it appears that he occupied a prominent and important place in the councils of the early church in Wisconsin, and he continued to play a conspicuous role in affairs of the convention for many years, serving on its important committees and shaping its policy. This reminds us of that assessment from John Chapin that I quoted at the beginning of this lecture. From the various glimpses we get of the man, Ordway was an interesting and forcible character, courageous, clear-headed, direct, and shrewd, as well as devoted. He seems to have been a tower of strength in that day. His opinions and sayings are much prized. We find traces of him in the important discussions of the church and in many of the revivals in this region. So what is the final assessment of Moses Ordway? His ministry is summarized by the supposedly beguiled Thomas Johnson in the following words. Moses Ordway had a passion for souls and gloried in the extension of the kingdom. He was an earnest and fearless preacher of righteousness, unfolding the gospel plan of salvation with great clearness and power. The old settlers of Wisconsin never forgot the pungent sermons of this man of God, nor the kindly offices and friendly welcomes of this pioneer Presbyterian missionary in Wisconsin. Another description of Ordway is also intriguing. Moses Ordway was perhaps the most colorful of the early Presbyterian ministers, a rugged individualist, a persistent promoter, an uncompromising Calvinist, and a Presbyterian zealot. And he dramatized almost everything that he undertook to do. An uncompromising Calvinist, a Presbyterian zealot. While Jesse Minor was first and foremost a pastor, and Cutting Marsh was a dedicated missionary, Moses Ordway excelled as a church planter. His contributions were not measured in lengthy ministries to specific congregations, but rather in church planting ventures often measured in months. Through his tireless efforts, the gospel came to many small frontier communities. As he preached Christ crucified, the lost heard the good news of salvation, and many came to put their trust in the only Savior of sinners. During the 1850s, there was a huge influx of immigrants from eastern states. Chapin describes the situation and Cutting Marsh's role as follows. From 1850 to 1853, there was a remarkable pouring in of people from the East. Foreign immigration had by that time hardly attracted notice. New England and New York institutions were rapidly developing in Wisconsin. Farms would open as if by magic. Villages of 500 or 1,000 inhabitants would spring up in a few months or a year. It was a busy task to attend to them all and see that ministers were supplied and sustained. Marsh, as the earliest on the ground and fully alive to the importance of the northeastern part of the state, was incessant in travel. During the first 15 years of his residence in the Fox River Valley, it is safe to say that there was not a white family north of that river. The incoming tide of civilization found him here, awake to the needs of the hour. To his intelligent and ready zeal, much of the church planting and growth in this district is due. That's Cutting Marsh. I believe the same could rightly be said for Moses Ordway and his ministry in the region south of the Fox River Valley. What Marsh did for north central Wisconsin, Ordway did in south central Wisconsin. These two men, often partners in establishing and organizing churches, led to the establishment of numerous Presbyterian congregations throughout the state. Over the next 100 years, Presbyterian church planting would explode into every corner of Wisconsin. In 1836, there was one Presbyterian church located in Green Bay. The next year saw the establishment of a second Presbyterian church, this time in Milwaukee. By 1936, 100 years later, there were 220 Presbyterian congregations organized in 5 presbyteries in every region of the state. For those 100 years, 1836 to 1936, church planting was the order of the day. In God's wise and sovereign will, Moses Ordway led the way, blazing a trail in the dense wilderness of Wisconsin to promote Presbyterianism throughout our corner of God's creation. Thank you.